The hammer echoes in the blizzard. For 15 years, I have buried my life here to escape the memories of my only daughter's death, and to hide from Evelyn, the stepwife who stripped away my entire estate behind a hypocritical mask. Slam! The heavy wooden door was violently blown open, crashing against the stone wall. Through the blinding white haze, a gaunt figure rushed inside and collapsed face down on the soot-covered floor, right at my feet. Summoning her remaining strength, the girl gripped the hem of my trousers, her eyes wide with panic and despair. She rasped, her voice choked as if bleeding. "Save me! She wants to kill me!" 15 years ago, the private plane carrying my daughter exploded amidst the Rockies during a brutal winter storm, just like tonight. The local sheriff back then had hurriedly closed the case file within just 72 hours, citing the harsh weather conditions as the tragic cause. I had collapsed, cried all my tears, and accepted the comfort from Evelyn, the woman who later became my stepwife. For 15 years, I shared my bed with her, turning over most of my assets and the family timber mills to her in exchange for a false sense of tranquility. But deep down in the heart of an old veteran, I always smelled a faint scent of deceit lingering in that house, even though I had no evidence to prove it. A loud noise suddenly rang out, cutting off my dark thoughts. The heavy wooden door of the forge was violently slammed open, crashing against the stone retaining wall. The blinding snow rushed in like a tidal wave, blowing out several lanterns hanging from the rafters and causing the furnace to erupt with bright red sparks. Amidst the white haze of snow at the entrance, a thin, breathless figure staggered forward and then collapsed face down on the gray soot-covered floor. I immediately released my metal tongs, threw the heavy hammer to the ground, and rushed toward the door with a soldier's instinct. It was a tattered woman, her clothes so torn that they could barely cover her body, which was shivering uncontrollably from the bone-chilling cold. Her hair was matted to a face covered in horrific scars, deep gashes that completely deformed the bone structure of her cheeks and a part of her temple. She could not speak, only letting out intermittent gasps of breath, and staring at me with wide eyes full of absolute terror, as if I were a dangerous, predatory threat. I gently carried the poor girl closer to the furnace, where the warmth could save her life before her body froze completely. I took the thickest and cleanest wool blanket from the corner of the room to wrap tightly around her small, cowering shoulders. I tried to ask her name, where she came from in this terrifying storm, but the only response was a choked, pathetic whimpering from her damaged throat. The girl was completely silent, her eyes scanning the surrounding blacksmith tools with the utmost vigilance of a hunted wild animal. As the girl began to stop shivering, I turned back to the furnace to get a cup of warm water for her to drink to regain some strength. Right then, the orange flame from the furnace shone directly on the waist area of the ragged coat she was wearing. A glint of metal flashed between the melting mud and snow, immediately catching my attention. It was a large, silver belt buckle, crude in shape but bearing a very unique craftsmanship style. I knelt down on the cold floor, gently pushing the torn fabric aside to get a clearer look at the silver buckle covered in soot. The surface of the silver bar was scratched by countless old cuts, but beneath the blurry layer of dust, the hand-carved lines began to reveal themselves clearly. It was the image of a mountain eagle soaring over a pine ridge, an incredibly intricate swirling pattern. This was the exact handcrafted work made from the exclusive forging technique of our Mackenzie family. The 19th birthday gift I had personally crafted for Sarah before that fateful night 15 years ago. My hands shook as I stared at the silver buckle, the metal cold against my calloused fingertips. The roaring wind outside seemed to fade into a distant hum, completely eclipsed by the sudden, violent hammering of my own heart. The fire from the furnace danced across the engraved surface, illuminating every ridge and curve of the mountain eagle I had spent 3 long nights carving so many years ago. I knew every microscopic flaw in that design, every stroke of the chisel, because it was born from my own hands. It was the exact buckle I had fastened around my daughter Sarah's waist 15 years ago, just days before her world shattered into pieces. I looked up from the silver piece to the woman shivering beneath the heavy wool blanket, my breath catching in my throat. The contrast was a brutal, physical blow that left me reeling in the dim light of the forge. The buckle belonged to Sarah, but the face before me was a landscape of tragic ruin, covered in thick, jagged scars that tore through her skin. Her cheekbones were misaligned, her jaw slightly crooked, as if broken and left to heal without a doctor's care. There was no trace of my beautiful, bright-eyed girl in this hollow, mutilated countenance that stared back at me with animal terror. A normal person would have seen a homeless stranger, a tragic drifter who had somehow found a dead girl's keepsake in some forgotten corner of the world. But a father's eyes do not look at the surface. They search for the ghost of what used to be. I leaned closer, my knees pressing into the hard dirt floor, desperate to find a single familiar line amidst the devastation. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of absolute panic, darting wildly from my face to the glowing coals of the forge. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, pressing herself against the brick wall, as if trying to disappear into the mortar. I tried to speak, but the words withered in my mouth, tasting of ash and old sorrow. For 15 years, I had lived a carefully constructed lie, letting Evelyn convince me that the mountains had swallowed our child whole. I had stood before an empty casket, listening to the hollow words of a preacher while my heart hardened into stone. Now, this broken creature was sitting in my workshop, breathing the same air, carrying a piece of my soul on her tattered clothes. The sheer impossibility of it threatened to snap my sanity, making my head spin with 1,000 frantic questions. If she was Sarah, how had she survived a plane crash that supposedly left nothing but scorched metal and ash on the peaks? Who had pulled her from the wreckage? And more importantly, who had done this to her face? The scars were not the jagged tears of twisted aluminum or the smooth burns of aviation fuel. They were deep, straight lines, the unmistakable markings of a deliberate, violent assault meant to erase her identity completely. Someone had wanted her gone, and when the mountain storm failed to finish the job, they had used their own hands to bury her in silence. The mute woman let out a soft, whimpering sound, her entire body trembling as I reached out a hand toward her. She flinched violently away from my touch, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps that echoed off the metal rafters. I pulled my hand back immediately, cursing my own impatience, realizing that to her, I was just a massive, terrifying stranger in a dark room. I forced my voice to drop into a low, soothing register, the tone I used to use when she was a little girl, frightened by the summer thunder. I told her she was safe here, that no one could hurt her inside these walls. But she only shook her head blindly. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy with unsaid horrors and a decade and a half of stolen time. I could see the fresh bruises on her wrists, purple and yellow marks that suggested she had been running from someone very recently. The blizzard outside was getting worse, the snow piling up against the window panes, sealing us inside this fiery sanctuary together. I knew I could not take her to the main house, not with Evelyn sleeping upstairs, unsuspecting and dangerous. I needed to understand what I was looking at before the rest of the world found out she was alive. My eyes drifted back to her hands, which were tightly clenched together beneath the edge of the blanket. They were rough, scarred by labor and freezing winters, the fingernails broken and packed with dark dirt. But the structure of her fingers, the long, delicate knuckles inherited from her mother, sent a fresh jolt of recognition through my veins. The mind can be tricked by a scarred face, but the underlying architecture of a human being remains a stubborn witness to the truth. I needed a sign, something undeniable, to bridge the gap between the daughter I lost and the drifter I found. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and predictable so as not to startle her further into the cold night. I walked over to the cooling rack near the anvil, where several scrap pieces of metal lay discarded from the evening's work. I picked up a smooth, cold iron rod, about a foot long, its weight comforting and solid in my palm. It was harmless, an inanimate object, but to someone who had been running for her life, it could be a tool of reassurance. I walked back toward her, holding the rod out horizontally, offering it to her like a shield. She watched the iron piece with intense focus, her breathing slowing down slightly as she processed my gesture. Slowly, hesitantly, her left arm emerged from the folds of the thick wool blanket, reaching out into the warm air. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, her grip tightening until her knuckles turned white against the black iron. The moment her hand closed around the rod, her posture shifted, the trembling in her arm ceasing instantly as a strange familiarity took over. Before I could even process the movement, her left hand began to move in a fluid, rhythmic motion. She flipped the iron rod lightly between her fingers, tapping it twice against the stone floor in a rapid, double-beat cadence. It was a completely unconscious action, a muscle memory buried so deep within her nervous system that even her amnesia could not touch it. My breath caught in my chest for the second time that night as I recognized the exact sequence. It was the unique, defensive grip and test rhythm I had drilled into Sarah since she was 10 years old. A left-handed blacksmith's daughter checking the balance of her tool. The iron rod felt solid and heavy in her slender left hand. She did not raise it like a weapon to attack, but her knuckles remained white as she held it close to her chest. I watched her from across the anvil, barely daring to breathe, fearing that any sudden movement would shatter the fragile connection we had just formed. Her eyes fixed on the massive piece of cast iron in front of her, and a strange, distant expression crossed her scarred face. It was the look of someone hearing a familiar melody from a past life. Faint, but undeniable. Slowly, she took a step forward, her bare feet pressing against the soot-covered floor without a sound. The heavy wool blanket slipped slightly from her shoulders, revealing the tense muscles of her left arm. She approached the anvil with a bizarre, instinctual confidence that did not match her tattered appearance. Her right hand remained limp at her side, but her left hand guided the iron rod toward the dark metal surface. My eyes widened as she bypassed the smaller tools and reached directly for my heaviest cross-peen hammer resting on the wooden block. That hammer weighed nearly 4 pounds, a tool designed for grown men with years of conditioning in the heat of the forge. Yet, her fingers wrapped around the hickory handle with absolute precision. Finding the exact balance point near the base, she lifted it without a single wobble, her shoulder dropping into the perfect alignment required to deliver a maximum blow. I felt a chill run down my spine, that had nothing to do with the freezing Montana winter outside. She raised the heavy iron head high into the air, catching the amber glow of the dying furnace flames. The heavy metal came down with a deafening crash that vibrated through the stone floor. The sharp sound echoed through the metal rafters of the old blacksmith shop, filling the small room with a piercing ring that smelled of sulfur and charcoal. But she did not stop there, because a split second later, she brought the hammer down twice in rapid succession. The rapid blows created a distinct, bouncing echo that broke the chaotic roaring of the blizzard outside. It was a beautiful, rhythmic cadence, a secret signature that I had invented 30 years ago to test the core density of heated carbon steel. I had drilled that exact rhythm into Sarah since she was 10 years old, making her practice until her left arm could deliver the strikes flawlessly without looking. It was our private language, a code shared only between a master blacksmith and his apprentice daughter. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the sight of the scarred woman standing before me. My mind had been filled with doubt, tormented by the horrific scars that had stolen her beautiful face. But her body had just delivered a piece of undeniable truth that no amount of violence or time could ever erase. Sarah was alive, standing in my workshop, even though her conscious mind could no longer find the words to call me father. The realization hit me like a physical blow, making my knees buckle slightly against the cold dirt floor. Her procedural memory, the deep neurological pathways formed by thousands of hours of repetition, had survived the trauma that broke her mind. She looked down at the hammer in her hand, a look of profound confusion washing over her features. She did not understand why she had done it, but her soul remembered the weight of the iron and the song of the anvil. The heavy tool slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor as she retreated back into the shadows of the corner. The sudden noise snapped me out of my emotional trance, replacing my grief with a sudden, sharp surge of protective urgency. It was already past midnight, and the main mansion of the Mackenzie estate sat less than a quarter mile up the ridge. My stepwife Evelyn was a light sleeper, a woman whose sharp eyes and suspicious nature never missed a change in the wind. If she found out that a strange, mute woman carrying Sarah's silver buckle had appeared at the forge, our chance at safety would vanish. I could not risk taking Sarah to the big house, nor could I leave her here where anyone from the timber mills might stumble upon her at dawn. Evelyn had eyes across this entire valley, paying the local workers handsomely to report any unusual activity to her. I needed a sanctuary, a place completely hidden from her network of spies and corrupt local officials. My mind immediately turned to my old hunting cabin, located deep within the Flathead National Forest, miles away from civilization. Evelyn despised that place because of its rugged isolation, and had not set foot near it in over 12 years. I began moving quickly around the forge, my old joints popping as I gathered essential supplies for our sudden flight. I packed a heavy canvas duffel bag with thick winter coats, dry rations, a flask of kerosene, and the medical first aid kit from the wall shelf. I carefully shoveled heavy gray ash over the glowing coils of the furnace, extinguishing the fire to make the workshop appear completely deserted. Sarah watched my frantic movements from the darkness, her eyes following me with a new layer of cautious trust. She had sensed the connection through the hammer strike, realizing that I was not her captor, but her protector. I walked over to her slowly, holding out a pair of insulated leather boots and a heavy dry jacket that used to belong to an old apprentice. She hesitated for a brief moment before taking them, her fingers brushing against mine with a warmth that sent hope flooding through my chest. I helped her wrap the heavy wool blanket tightly around her head to shield her mutilated face from the biting wind. We stepped out of the back door of the forge, immediately swallowed by the blinding white curtain of the mountain storm. The freezing snow crunched loudly beneath our boots as I guided her toward my old four-wheel drive truck hidden beneath the pine trees, ready to escape into the dark, protective embrace of the Montana wilderness. The old four-wheel drive truck groaned as its tires bit into the deep snowdrifts blocking the mountain switchbacks. The visibility was near zero, a blinding white wall of ice and wind that threatened to push us off the narrow ledge at every turn. Sarah sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, her scarred face hidden beneath the oversized hood of the winter coat I had given her. She did not make a sound, but her hands were tightly clenched around the iron rod she had brought from the forge, treating it like a sacred lifeline. I kept my eyes locked on the faint outline of the pine trees, navigating purely by memory until the low silhouette of the hunting cabin appeared out of the frozen darkness. We stepped inside the small structure, the air thick with the smell of old cedar, stale wood smoke, and the deep chill of a place abandoned for years. I immediately went to work at the stone fireplace, using my pocket knife to shave dry kindling from a pine log until the sparks from my flint caught the wood. Within minutes, a small fire began to crackle and stretch across the hearth, casting long amber shadows across the rustic room and slowly pushing back the numbing cold. I helped Sarah sit down on the edge of the old wooden cot near the hearth, wrapping her in 3 layers of heavy wool blankets until her shivering finally began to subside. She looked into the growing flames, her eyes wide and reflecting the light, her expression a mix of relief and deep confusion, as if she were trying to remember why this place felt safe. Once I was certain she was warm enough, I walked over to the corner of the small kitchen area where an old landline telephone hung on the log wall. This was a private line, unregistered and paid for through an anonymous account I had maintained since my days in the service, completely hidden from Evelyn's watchful eyes and financial audits. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver, listening to the steady dial tone before punching in a 10-digit number that I had kept memorized for over 30 years. The line rang 4 times, the sound echoing hollowly in my ear until a deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end with a sharp tone of caution. It was Theodore Miller, a retired federal detective and the only man in Montana who owed me his life from our time under the burning sun of foreign sands. I did not offer any pleasantries, nor did I use her full name over an unsecured connection, knowing that walls always have ears in this county. I simply told him that the lost eagle had returned to the nest, but her wings were broken. And then I gave him the exact geographical coordinates of the hunting cabin. There was a long, heavy silence on the line as Miller processed the weight of those words, his breathing deep and steady through the receiver. He did not ask how or why, because a man of his background understood that questions could wait when a brother-in-arms called for help in the dead of night. He muttered a single confirmation before hanging up, leaving me with the quiet hum of the dead line and a mounting sense of dread about what we were about to uncover. 3 hours crawled past like an eternity, while the storm outside continued to bash against the sturdy log walls of the cabin. Sarah had eventually drifted into a restless sleep, her head resting uncomfortably against a rolled-up blanket on the cot. Her breathing was uneven, interrupted by soft whimpers that tore at my heart, her fingers twitching against the wool fabric as if she were still fighting off her invisible captors in her dreams. I sat in a wooden rocking chair across from her, a loaded rifle resting across my lap, my eyes shifting between my sleeping daughter and the dark windows. Every creak of the timber rafters made my hand tighten around the cold steel of the trigger guard. my mind racing with the realization of the danger we were now in. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, the distant sound of a laboring engine broke through the howling of the wind, accompanied by the crunching of heavy tires on frozen gravel. I stood up immediately, stepping into the shadows beside the front door, my thumb pulling back the hammer of the rifle with a soft mechanical click. The headlights of a heavy four-wheel-drive SUV swept across the frost-covered window panes before cutting out, plunging the clearing back into darkness. A moment later, a massive silhouette emerged from the snowstorm, stomping the ice off his heavy boots before knocking 3 times on the thick wooden door in a specific, uneven pattern. I threw the bolt open, allowing Theodore Miller to step into the warmth, his massive frame wrapped in a snow-covered sheepskin coat. Miller pulled down his woolen scarf, revealing a face lined by decades of tracking the worst elements of human nature, his gray eyes immediately locking onto the cot. He walked over to the sleeping woman with soft steps that belied his immense size, standing over her for a long minute without speaking a word. He looked at the horrific scars on her face, his jaw clenching tightly as he recognized the unmistakable bone structure of the young girl he had helped me search for 15 years ago. He turned back to me, his expression grim and devoid of any warmth, and patted my shoulder with a heavy hand before walking to the center table. He placed a faded leather briefcase onto the wooden surface, unbuckling the tarnished brass clasps with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like the opening of a tomb. Inside the briefcase sat a thick manila folder bound by official federal twine, its edges yellowed and brittle with 15 years of dust and neglect. This was the complete, archived investigative record of the plane crash that was supposed to have ended my daughter's life on the frozen peaks of the Rockies. Miller pulled up a wooden stool, gesturing for me to sit beside him under the amber glow of the single oil lantern hanging from the center beam. He opened the folder, the smell of old paper and chemical ink filling the small space between us as he began to flip through the sheets. Every page was stamped with official seals, a detailed ledger of tragedy that I had been denied access to by the local authorities when my grief was fresh. Miller stopped turning the pages when he reached the middle section of the report, which contained the technical analysis of the aircraft's mechanical systems. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small magnifying glass and holding it over the heavy binding threads that held the documents together. Look closely at the page sequence numbers printed at the bottom of these sheets. Mac, he whispered, his voice dangerously low and steady. I leaned in, my eyes straining under the dim light as I followed his finger along the numerical indicators at the bottom corner of the paper. The sequence jumped directly from page 41 to page 43, leaving a sudden, impossible gap in the official record. I looked closer at the center seam and saw the clean, straight edge of a white sliver of paper, proving that page 42 had been deliberately sliced out of the file with a razor blade. In its place, someone had inserted a completely different document, a single paragraph typed on cheap paper that bore the official signature of the county sheriff. This inserted page claimed that the engine pressure was completely normal up until the moment of impact, blaming the entire disaster on pilot error caused by the blinding blizzard. The county sheriff had personally signed off on this fabrication, using his authority to close the case file and bury the investigation before any federal inspectors could reach the mountain site. This was the first undeniable proof of a deadly conspiracy that went far deeper than a simple family betrayal or a tragic accident. Page 42 was the original federal laboratory analysis of the engine's fuel lines, the very document that would have proven whether the plane was sabotaged before takeoff. The county sheriff had actively participated in a cover-up, destroying official federal records to protect the person who had paid to have my daughter eliminated. The realization settled into my gut like a block of ice as I stared at the sheriff's crooked signature, knowing that the man sworn to protect our valley was actually the guard dog, protecting the monster, sleeping in my own bed. The flickering yellow flame of the oil lantern danced unsteadily across the rough surface of the cedar table, casting elongated shadows that seemed to distort the faces of the two old soldiers. Theodore Miller leaned back on his wooden stool, his heavy jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line as he stared down at the altered manila folder. The silence between us grew dense, heavy with the weight of an unpunished crime that had corrupted the very foundation of our small valley for a decade and a half. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, the frozen branches of the pine trees scratching against the log walls like fingernails demanding entry. Miller rubbed his weary eyes with a large, scarred hand before looking across the table at me with a gaze that had seen the absolute worst of humanity. He explained that a cover-up of this magnitude could not have been executed by a grieving widow alone, especially not one who had arrived in the county with nothing but a cheap suitcase and a silver tongue. The local sheriff, a man whose salary was paid by the taxpayers, had clearly been bought and paid for, long before the private plane ever took off from the tarmac. Evelyn had woven a web of financial dependency and political influence so tight that it had effectively smothered the truth before it could ever reach a federal investigator. I listened to my old friend, my teeth grinding together so hard that a sharp pain shot up into my temples, mirroring the burning rage in my gut. For 15 long years, I had blamed God. I had blamed the mountain winter, and I had blamed my own negligence for the loss of my only child. All the while, the true author of my misery was sleeping under my roof, spending my family money, and pretending to comfort me during my darkest hours of despair. The sheer magnitude of the deception was sickening, a toxic realization that threatened to burn away whatever restraint I had left in my old bones. But as I looked over at the cot where Sarah lay sleeping, her scarred face twitching under the heavy wool blankets, the reckless urge to hunt Evelyn down was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I leaned forward across the wooden table, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that barely carried over the crackling of the pine logs in the fireplace. I told Miller that while I may have been blinded by grief in the beginning, an old reconnaissance soldier never completely drops his guard, even in his own home. I revealed that 3 years ago, in the winter of 2021, I had noticed subtle discrepancies in our timber mill accounting logs that Evelyn could not explain. She had assumed I was just an aging, broken blacksmith who did not understand the complexities of modern corporate finance and legal loopholes. She believed I was content to let her manage the estate while I hid away in my noisy, dark workshop to escape the ghost of my daughter. But those tiny financial irregularities had triggered an old instinct, a quiet alarm that told me someone was systematically bleeding the Mackenzie legacy dry from the inside out. Instead of confronting her and risking a premature exposure of her hand, I decided to play the part of the oblivious, submissive husband while preparing a secret counteroffensive. I told Miller about my clandestine trips to Seattle under the guise of buying specialized forging steel and antique equipment for the workshop. During those weekends away, I had bypassed every local law firm in the county, knowing they were all connected to Evelyn's social and professional circle. Instead, I had retained the services of Marcus Vance, a high-profile corporate defense attorney whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary across the entire Pacific Northwest. Vance was a man who did not care about small-town politics, and more importantly, he was someone Evelyn could never hope to buy or intimidate. Together, Vance and I had quietly established an ironclad legal structure known as the Montana Legacy Trust, a separate financial entity completely independent of the marital estate. Over the course of 12 months, I had systematically transferred the true ownership of the ancestral timberlands, the water rights, and the primary manufacturing assets into this private trust. Evelyn was left as the public face of a grand corporation, operating a shell company that she believed was worth millions of dollars. In reality, the true wealth of the Mackenzie family had been legally isolated and locked behind an impenetrable vault that only Sarah or I could ever open. Miller stared at me for a long moment, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face as he began to appreciate the depth of the trap I had built. He whispered that I had essentially given her enough rope to hang herself, allowing her to negotiate deals for property she did not legally own. If she attempted to finalize the sale of the valley lands to a foreign conglomerate, she would be committing a massive federal fraud that no local sheriff could ever shield her from. The legal trap was perfectly set. But we still lacked the physical evidence to tie her directly to the original murder conspiracy 15 years earlier. We needed the contents of page 42, the original technical report that proved the fuel lines had been intentionally compromised before the plane took off into the storm. Miller noted that the sheriff's office kept their oldest archived files in a secure basement vault at the county seat, a place guarded by loyal deputies 24 hours a day. Breaking into that facility would be a federal offense, a desperate gamble that could ruin both of our lives before we could ever present the truth to a grand jury. We sat there in the dim light, weighing the immense risks of an infiltration against the absolute necessity of obtaining the missing paperwork. Suddenly, Sarah let out a sharp, muffled gasp from the wooden cot, her body stiffening as she bolted upright into a sitting position. Her dark eyes were wide with a sudden, overwhelming panic, her gaze fixed entirely on the dark, frosted window pane facing the eastern tree line. Miller instantly dropped his hand to the holster beneath his heavy coat, while I grabbed the loaded rifle leaning against the table, my thumb easing the safety mechanism off with a silent click. The howling of the wind outside seemed to drop for a brief second, replaced by a low, mechanical rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. A blinding beam of white light suddenly sliced through the darkness, cutting across the frost-covered glass and illuminating the entire interior of the cabin with a harsh, surgical brilliance. The high beams washed over the stone fireplace, the table, and our frozen figures, forcing us to shield our eyes from the sudden intensity. It was the distinct, unmistakable silhouette of a heavy luxury sport utility vehicle, a blacked-out Range Rover, identical to the one favored by the senior partners of the estate's law firm. The vehicle lingered at the edge of the woods for 30 agonized seconds, its engine idling like a growling beast, before shifting into reverse and backing slowly down the hidden trail, plunging the cabin back into the dark and terrifying silence of the mountain night. The smell of pine and the seeds of betrayal. The heavy mountain fog rolled in, wrapping the thick pine trees around the hunting cabin in a dense blanket of gray slate. The roaring blizzard from the night before had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a suffocating, frozen stillness. Theodore Miller stood by the frosted window, his hand near his weapon as his gray eyes scanned the impenetrable wall of mist outside. We both knew the black Range Rover that had breached the darkness hours ago was no coincidence, meaning Evelyn's hounds were already closing in on us. I walked over to the wood stove, throwing 2 more blocks of split cedar into the iron belly to keep the damp cold away. Sarah remained curled on the wooden cot, her breathing heavy but shallow as she drifted between exhaustion and fractured consciousness. The thick blankets rose and fell with each ragged breath she took, a painful reminder of the fragile thread keeping her tethered to this world. I needed to find a way to keep her warm, as the mountain chill was beginning to seep through the log seams. I remembered an old canvas winter coat left in my truck weeks ago. I stepped out into the freezing fog, the icy air burning my lungs as I retrieved the garment and hurried back inside. The coat was stiff from the freezing temperature, so I held it close to the fireplace, letting the heat soften the rugged canvas material. As the fabric warmed up, a sudden, distinct aroma began to rise from the collar, spreading through the small space of the cabin. It was a sweet, heavy scent of lavender oil, a fragrance that immediately clashed with the rustic smells of old wood smoke and dry cedar. My stomach tightened into a knot as I recognized the perfume. Realizing this jacket had been hanging in the mudroom closet right next to Evelyn's expensive winter wardrobe just days ago. The synthetic scent clung to the fibers like an invisible stain that carried the essence of the woman who stole my life. Before I could move the jacket away, a sharp, ragged gasp cut through the quiet room from the direction of the cot. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat as I saw Sarah staring blankly at the canvas coat in my hands. Her dark eyes were wide with a sudden, overwhelming terror. The pupils dilated until they almost swallowed the brown irises entirely. Her scarred face contorted into a mask of pure agony, the pale tissue of her jagged scars turning a sickly, bright white against her flushed skin. She began to shake violently, her entire body stiffening as if she had been struck by an electrical current. She bolted upright, her fingernails clawing frantically at her own scalp as she tried to block out the invisible monster that had just invaded her sanctuary. She threw herself off the cot, crashing heavily onto the dirt floor, her limbs thrashing uncontrollably amidst the tangled blankets. Miller moved instantly, dropping his briefcase and rushing forward to help me restrain her before she could cause serious injury. We knelt beside her, my large hands gently pinning her trembling shoulders down, while Miller held her legs to prevent her from fracturing her ankles against the stone hearth. It was an agonizing sight, watching my daughter fight against a phantom memory tearing her mind apart. Her teeth chattered loudly as a thick sob caught in her damaged throat, her head twisting violently from side to side as she tried to escape the scent. The sweet aroma of lavender acted as a brutal psychological trigger that had broken through the heavy walls of her amnesia. She was no longer in the safe isolation of the Montana wilderness. Her mind had been violently dragged back to the horrific night 15 years ago when her world collapsed into fire and blood. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, her chest heaving in a desperate struggle to draw oxygen into her collapsing lungs. I held her close, whispering her name over and over. The force of her violent convulsions began to push me backward, her left hand gripping my forearm with a terrifying strength born from pure adrenaline. Her fingers dug deep into my skin, her nails drawing thin lines of blood as she held onto me like a drowning person grabbing driftwood. Miller shouted for me to hold her head steady, his face pale with panic as he realized she was suffocating on her own tongue. I shifted my weight, cradling her scarred skull between my palms, feeling the tremors vibrating through her bones as the invisible storm raged inside her brain. Just when it felt like her heart would burst, the violent thrashing began to slow down, replaced by a rigid, trembling paralysis. Her breathing became incredibly shallow, a series of short, clicking gasps that sounded like a dying engine trying to catch its final breath of fuel. She stared directly up at the ceiling, her dark eyes slowly refocusing as a flood of hot tears ran down her ruined cheeks, washing away the gray soot from the forge floor. Her lips trembled violently, her jaw moving in a desperate attempt to form shapes that her damaged vocal cords had denied her for over a decade. I leaned closer, my ear pressing nearly against her mouth, my own breath suspended in absolute silence as I waited for any sign of recovery. Miller held his breath beside me, the only sound in the cabin being the soft crackling of the pine logs fading in the fireplace. A low, raspy click emerged from deep within her chest, a mechanical sound that gradually transformed into a harsh, whispered rasp that tore through the quiet room. It was a guttural utterance, the sound of a human soul breaking through 15 years of forced silence to deliver a message from the grave. She gasped for air one final time, her fingers tightening around my wrist until the bone beneath creaked under the pressure of her grip. Her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying, crystal-clear lucidity that I had not seen since she was a teenager, standing in our old home. Her mouth opened wide, and she finally choked out her very first broken words in a voice that sounded like crushed glass sliding across winter ice. "The fuel tank," she whispered, her chest heaving as she forced the final, damning syllables past her bleeding lips. She signed the fuel tank. Sarah sank back down onto the wooden cot, her body suddenly going completely limp as the immense exhaustion took over once more. The heavy effort of forcing those few words past her damaged throat had drained whatever residual strength she had left from her narrow escape through the blizzard. Her eyelids fluttered shut, her breathing returning to a shallow, rhythmic wheeze that filled the quiet cabin with a haunting sound. Theodore Miller and I remained frozen by her side, her final words still hanging heavily in the cold air between us, like an unexploded shell. "The fuel tank," she had whispered. A terrifying revelation that completely reoriented the entire trajectory of our dark investigation. I reached out and gently pulled the thick wool blanket up to her chin, my hand trembling as I looked at the deep lines of trauma etched into her scarred face. My mind was spinning backward in time, remembering the exact day of the funeral when Evelyn had wrapped her arms around my weeping shoulders, offering hollow words of comfort. She had stood beside me in front of that empty grave, wearing a black veil to hide her eyes, pretending to share the agonizing weight of my broken heart. All the while, she knew exactly what had happened to the plane, carrying the dark secret of her malice while she systematically moved into my home and took control of my life. The sheer, cold-blooded nature of her betrayal felt like a physical poison coursing through my veins, turning my sorrow into a cold, diamond-hard necessity for absolute justice. Miller stood up slowly from the bedside, his face grim as he walked back over to the cedar table where his leather briefcase lay open under the oil lantern. He reached deep inside the secondary compartment, pulling out a thick binder containing the digitized transaction ledgers of the Mackenzie enterprise from 15 years ago. These were the raw, unedited operational expenses that Evelyn thought had been safely archived and forgotten in the damp basement of our old downtown corporate office. Miller flipped through the pages with practiced efficiency, his thick thumb tracing the column lines for any irregular equipment purchases, specialized industrial chemicals, or unverified maintenance requisitions made in the week leading up to the disaster. His gray eyes scanned the old printouts, looking for anything that could explain why my daughter would associate her stepmother with an aviation fuel tank. The only sound in the small cabin was the crisp rustling of paper and the low hiss of the oil lantern as Miller meticulously cross-referenced the corporate accounts. After several minutes of intense concentration, his fingers suddenly stopped turning the pages, locking onto an entry dated exactly 2 days before the fateful flight took off into the winter skies. He adjusted the glass chimney of his lantern, increasing the light, and gestured for me to pull up a stool so I could read the fine print of a commercial invoice from a specialty chemical supply company based out of Seattle. The requisition was for 4 gallons of a highly concentrated, industrial-grade corrosive compound, specifically designed to break down and dissolve synthetic rubber and advanced polymer seals. The delivery destination listed on the shipping manifest was not our timber mill or the main manufacturing warehouse, but rather the private municipal hangar where my family aircraft was stored. At the very bottom of the invoice, written in an elegant, flowing cursive script that I would recognize anywhere, was the clear and undeniable signature of Evelyn Blanchard Mackenzie. My chest tightened until it felt like my ribs would snap, a suffocating pressure building in my lungs as the chilling pieces of the puzzle began to lock together. Evelyn had absolutely no legitimate operational business purchasing highly volatile industrial solvents, let alone having them routed directly to a private aviation facility under a shell account. Miller pulled another document from his file. A detailed roster of the ground crew and contracted maintenance mechanics who had unrestricted access to the airfield during that specific winter week. He pointed his heavy finger at a name near the bottom of the ledger. A senior aviation mechanic named Walter Vance, who had abruptly resigned and vanished from the state just 24 hours after the crash was officially reported. Miller leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that carried the grim authority of a seasoned federal investigator who had spent a lifetime tracking monsters. He explained that his old contacts in the Financial Intelligence Unit had tracked a sudden, anomalous cash deposit of $40,000 into a private bank account held by Walter Vance in Idaho. The money had been deposited via an anonymous courier service on the very morning of the flight, just hours before Sarah climbed into the cockpit of that doomed aircraft. The paper trail was deliberately obscured, but the timing was a definitive, undeniable confession of sabotage. A meticulously staged plan designed to ensure that the plane would never survive its journey over the frozen peaks. Evelyn had not merely hoped for an accident. She had actively purchased the instruments of destruction and hired a professional insider to execute the execution. The mechanic had taken the highly concentrated corrosive compound and applied it directly to the primary fuel line connectors and emergency shutoff valves of the aircraft. The chemical solvent was specifically chosen because it would not cause an immediate, obvious failure that could be detected during a standard pre-flight inspection by the pilot. Instead, it was designed to slowly eat through the synthetic rubber gaskets over a period of several hours, creating a progressive degradation of the fuel system seals. When the aircraft finally reached its cruising altitude and the engine was forced to operate under maximum pressure against the freezing mountain headwinds, the compromised seals would inevitably blow out. It would cause a catastrophic, uncontainable fuel leak directly onto the hot exhaust manifolds, ensuring an immediate, explosive mid-air disaster that would leave no survivors and no forensic evidence behind on the burning mountainside. I sat there in the silence of the cabin, the heavy weight of the realization settling into my bones like a block of solid ice as I stared at Evelyn's elegant signature on the copy of the document. She had planned the entire atrocity down to the exact hour, using her knowledge of the upcoming winter storm to provide the perfect cover of a weather-related accident. She had sent my innocent daughter into the freezing skies with a ticking chemical time bomb hidden inside the belly of the plane, all to satisfy her boundless greed for the Mackenzie empire. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, unyielding clarity took its place. A silent vow that I would not rest until every single person who signed that ledger was brought to absolute ruin. We had the motive, and we had the paper trail for the chemicals. But Miller reminded me that a clever defense attorney could still argue the signature was a forgery or a corporate misunderstanding without a direct link to Sarah's survival. We still needed the ultimate physical piece of evidence that Sarah had managed to secure before the world exploded around her. A hidden truth that was waiting for us, somewhere out there, in the frozen dark. The yellow light of the afternoon sun slowly broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting pale streaks across the frosted windows of our hidden sanctuary. Sarah stirred quietly on the wooden cot, her eyelids fluttering open without the sudden panic that had consumed her during the terrifying episode the previous night. There was a newfound clarity in her dark eyes, a focused lucidity that told me the chaotic storm inside her fractured mind had receded into the shadows. She sat up slowly, adjusting the blankets around her waist, and watched the thin trails of cedar smoke rise from the iron stove with calm, deliberate attention. I walked over to her side, carrying a warm tin bowl of simple venison broth, and she accepted it with her left hand, offering a small nod of gratitude that warmed my weary heart. After she finished the warm liquid, I brought over a thick pad of rough yellow paper and a pencil, hoping desperately that she could write down the crucial details her damaged vocal cords could not voice. She took the yellow wood between her fingers, her brow furrowing with concentration as she pressed the graphite tip against the blank page. But the moment she attempted to form the very first letter, her hand began to tremble violently, the muscles in her forearm tightening into hard, uncontrollable knots. The frustration that washed over her scarred face was agonizing to witness, a silent torment as she realized the delicate motor skills required to write had been completely severed by her past injuries. She dropped the pencil with a soft, defeated sigh, her head lowering onto her chest as a single tear left a dark circle on the paper. I knelt beside her on the cold dirt floor, gently taking her trembling left hand in my own calloused palms to offer what little comfort an old father could provide. I reached across the hearth and retrieved a small, cooled piece of charred pine wood from the edge of the fireplace, its surface powdery but solid enough to hold. I placed the charcoal block into her fingers, pointing toward the clean sheet of yellow paper, and whispered softly that she did not need words to tell me her story. Her expression transformed instantly as her fingers adjusted to the rough texture of the charcoal, a sudden wave of confidence returning to her posture. She flattened the paper against her knees and began to draw, with powerful strokes that were shockingly precise and devoid of hesitation. Her left hand moved across the page with a fluid grace, the charcoal leaving thick lines that rapidly took shape. Within a few minutes, a detailed and recognizable image emerged from the paper, capturing my absolute attention. It was a perfectly rendered illustration of a mountain falcon with its massive wings fully spread in mid-flight. My breath caught in my throat, a cold shock running down my spine as I examined the geometric patterns of the feathers and the aggressive curve of the bird's razor-sharp beak. This was an exact replica of an emblem that I knew by heart, a unique signature deeply tied to my own history. In the summer of 2012, I spent 2 weeks restoring a rare 19th-century Winchester rifle that belonged to my grandfather. I personally hand-carved that exact falcon emblem into the rich walnut stock, using a fine chisel under the lantern light to perfect every individual feather. It was a unique masterpiece, an heirloom I eventually gifted to an old, fiercely loyal collector named Arthur Vance, who lived in Helena. Sarah sat beside my anvil every single night during that summer, watching the curls of walnut wood fall to the floor while I carved that stock. She memorized the shape of that falcon, and now she was using it as a beacon to guide me through the darkness of her forgotten past. I stared intensely at the drawing, my mind racing through the logical implications of what my daughter was trying to communicate with such desperate urgency. She looked up from the yellow paper, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a burning intensity that demanded my absolute understanding. She tapped her scarred finger repeatedly against the drawn falcon emblem, then pointed toward the western horizon where the mountain highways led toward the capital city of Helena. The realization settled into my chest with the immense force of an avalanche, making my old heart race with hope and sudden danger. Sarah had not merely remembered the rifle because of sentimental value. She had actively utilized a hidden compartment within that weapon as a secure vault. Before climbing into the cockpit of that doomed aircraft 15 years ago, she had hidden something of monumental importance inside that antique firearm. She knew with absolute certainty that the rifle in Arthur Vance's private collection would remain completely safe from Evelyn's greedy search parties. Evelyn had always despised my passion for old firearms, viewing them as useless junk, and never paid attention to the rare pieces I gifted to my closest friends across the state. The old collector in Helena was a man of absolute honor, a retired gentleman who would never allow anyone to access his private vault without my explicit presence. I turned to face Theodore Miller, who had been watching our silent interaction from the kitchen counter while sipping black coffee. I held up the yellow paper, showing him the charcoal drawing of the soaring falcon and explaining the connection to the grandfather's rifle in Helena. Miller's gray eyes narrowed instantly into slits as his seasoned detective instincts grasped the vital strategic importance of this new lead. He set his mug down with a firm thud and stated that we needed to move toward Helena as quickly as possible. Evelyn's scouts would notice my absence from the timber mills by tomorrow morning, and we could not afford to let her realize we had crossed the county lines in search of her secrets. The mountain storm had passed, leaving behind a treacherous landscape covered in black ice and packed snowdrifts that would make the journey difficult. I quickly packed the remaining rations and medical supplies into our canvas duffel bag, ensuring my loaded hunting rifle remained hidden beneath the rear bench seat of the truck. Sarah was already pulling the heavy winter coat over her shoulders, her movements filled with a quiet determination that mirrored my own resolve. We were preparing to step out of the safe isolation of the national forest and move directly into the path of danger. But the promise of uncovering the truth was worth the risk. I locked the timber door of the hunting cabin behind us, the key cold in my palm, and guided my daughter toward the idling truck as the afternoon faded into twilight. The antique rifle and the microfilm. The neon lights of the Helena outskirts flickered through the heavy gray mist as my old truck pulled into the gravel driveway of the abandoned brick warehouse. The journey from the national forest had taken us nearly 4 hours of navigating slick highways and avoiding the main interstate checkpoints where the county deputies usually lingered. Sarah sat quietly beside me, her eyes alert as she watched the shadowed silhouette of the massive building through the cracked windshield. I cut the engine, letting the truck slide into the deep shadows beneath an overgrown oak tree, plunging us into a tense silence broken only by the ticking of the cooling manifold. We walked toward the heavy iron side door of the warehouse, the freezing air carrying the bitter scent of industrial rust and old coal dust. I knocked 4 times on the cold metal surface, waiting in the darkness until a small viewing slit slid open, revealing a pair of sharp, brilliant blue eyes behind thick glasses. The heavy deadbolts retracted with a loud mechanical clatter, and Arthur Vance stepped back into the warmth of the interior, his wrinkled face softening as he recognized me. He was a man of 72 years, his back slightly bent, but his hands as steady as the day he retired from the Federal Reserve. Arthur quickly guided us down a narrow corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling wooden crates, leading us into his private office, where a small coal stove provided a pocket of comfortable warmth. He poured 3 mugs of strong black chicory coffee, placing them on a scarred oak desk that was cluttered with antique ledgers and restoration tools. He looked at Sarah, his old eyes widening slightly as he noticed the deep, silver-colored scars tracing across her cheekbones and temple. He did not ask any intrusive questions. because a true gentleman of the mountains understood that survival always carried a heavy price. Before we could even begin to discuss the Winchester rifle, the old landline telephone resting on Arthur's desk began to ring with a sharp, demanding tone. Arthur picked up the receiver, listened for a brief second, and then handed it across the desk to me with a grave expression, whispering that the caller refused to speak to anyone but the master blacksmith. I pressed the heavy plastic against my ear, and the voice of Albert Cross, the retired chief accountant of the Mackenzie Timber Mills, filled my ear with an uncharacteristic edge of sheer panic. Albert had been a loyal friend to my father, and he was the only person left inside the corporate office who still kept an eye on the ledgers for me. "Mac, you need to listen to me very carefully, because you are running out of time," Albert whispered, his breath ragged through the line. He revealed that less than 2 hours ago, Evelyn had arrived at the downtown office, accompanied by a team of high corporate attorneys from Delaware. She was forcing through the final executive closure on a secret purchase agreement that would sell the entire Ancestral Valley land rights to an offshore shell conglomerate. Evelyn had presented an older power of attorney document bearing my signature, claiming that my health was rapidly failing and that I was no longer fit to manage the family assets. The contract was structured to be completely finalized by noon on Friday, a move that would legally strip the Mackenzie name from every acre of timberland our family had protected for 3 generations. Albert stated that the buyers had already wired a non-refundable deposit of $10 million into a private corporate escrow account, and Evelyn was preparing to flee the country the moment the ink dried on the final deed. A wave of blinding, suffocating rage washed over my chest, my fingers tightening around the telephone receiver until the plastic casing began to creak under the pressure of my grip. The sheer greed of the woman was boundless, a parasitic hunger that would not stop until she had burned our entire history to absolute ash. I forced my breathing to slow down, refusing to let the anger cloud my tactical focus when we were so close to uncovering the ultimate piece of leverage. I thanked Albert for his loyalty, telling him to quietly gather whatever transfer logs he could print without raising suspicion before hanging up the receiver. I looked across the desk at Arthur, my jaw set in a hard line as I explained that the clock was officially ticking against us, and that we needed to access the private vault immediately. Arthur nodded grimly, his blue eyes flashing with cold determination as he stood up and reached for a heavy brass ring holding a dozen antique skeleton keys. We followed the old collector through a reinforced steel security door, stepping into a vast, climate-controlled room that felt like a quiet sanctuary for forgotten history. The air was crisp and smelled of fine gun oil, beeswax, and the rich aroma of aged walnut wood stocks lining the custom display cases. Arthur walked past rows of historic cavalry swords and antique revolvers, stopping at the very end of the long room where a single gun case sat protected by a heavy digital combination lock. He punched in the code, the electronic mechanism releasing with a solid thud, and pulled open the glass door to reveal a long object wrapped tightly in protective red velvet fabric. Arthur gently laid the velvet bundle onto the center of the large oak desk, his movements slow and full of reverence for the history wrapped inside. I reached out with my trembling hands, my fingers gripping the edge of the soft red fabric and slowly unrolling it to expose the weapon beneath. The polished steel barrel of the 19th century Winchester rifle caught the amber light of the oil lantern, gleaming with a dark, oily brilliance. The rich grain of the walnut wood stock emerged from the velvet folds, its surface smooth and perfectly preserved by years of meticulous care in this private sanctuary. My eyes drifted immediately to the rear section of the wooden stock, where the hand-carved silhouette of the soaring mountain falcon sat etched into the dark timber. Every individual feather of the massive wings was a testament to the hours I had spent under the lantern lights so many years ago, using a fine chisel to breathe life into the dead wood. Sarah had sat right next to my iron anvil during that distant summer, watching the small curls of walnut wood fall onto the floor, while her mother hummed a quiet tune in the kitchen. Now, that very same carving stood before us, as the silent vault containing the truth of our family tragedy. Sarah stepped forward from the shadows of the room, her dark eyes completely locked onto the weapon resting on the table. She did not display any fear or hesitation this time, her posture straightening as a profound sense of familiarity seemed to wash over her scarred features. She reached out her left hand, her long fingers hovering over the polished wood of the stock before gently lowering them onto the carved falcon emblem. The touch was light, almost like a caress, as her skin met the textured ridges of the chiseled feathers she had memorized as a young girl. Theodore Miller and Arthur stood perfectly still on either side of the desk, their breathing suspended as they watched my daughter interact with the antique firearm. This was the ultimate test of her procedural memory, the deep physical instincts that remained alive within her body even while her conscious mind was trapped behind a wall of silence. Sarah's thumb began to move in a fluid, rhythmic circle across the center of the falcon's chest, tracing the outline of the master heart carved into the wood. She was not guessing or searching blindly, because her hand moved with the absolute certainty of a creator returning to her creation. Suddenly, her thumb stopped at a microscopic knot in the grain of the walnut wood, located just below the left wingtip of the carved bird. She applied a firm, inward pressure with her thumb, pushing down on a tiny section of the timber that appeared completely seamless to the naked eye. A soft, mechanical click echoed through the quiet office, a sharp metallic sound that broke the heavy silence between us like a gunshot. A small, rectangular panel of the walnut stock popped open by a fraction of an inch, revealing a hidden compartment that had been meticulously hollowed out from the solid wood. I gasped for air, a sudden wave of heat rushing into my chest as I realized the absolute brilliance of my daughter's foresight before she stepped onto that doomed flight. She had utilized the deep workshop secrets I taught her to create a secure vault that no corporate auditor or corrupt deputy could ever find. She slid her fingers into the narrow opening, her nails catching the edge of a small object nestled deep inside the solid timber of the grandfather's weapon. She slowly extracted a tiny, cylindrical capsule, its silver metallic casing entirely wrapped in a protective layer of clear, moisture-resistant polymer silicone. Sarah placed the small silver capsule onto the palm of my hand, her dark eyes meeting mine with a quiet, triumphant intensity that brought fresh tears to my eyes. The capsule was cold against my skin, but its weight felt like a monumental anchor of justice that would soon crush the empire of deceit Evelyn had built. Arthur Vance quickly stepped over to his workbench, retrieving a small pair of precision brass pliers and a sharp scalpel to help me open the protective polymer seal. He worked with the steady care of a surgeon, slicing through the thick silicone layer without scratching the precious metallic container hidden within. Once the outer protective coating was fully removed, Arthur handed the clean silver capsule back to me, pointing toward a tiny threaded cap at the top of the cylinder. I carefully unscrewed the metal cap, my fingers slippery with sweat as the fine threads turned slowly under my touch. Inside the hollow chamber sat a small spool of high-resolution microfilm, its dark plastic ribbons tightly wound around a central core no larger than a matchstick. This tiny piece of vintage technology carried the physical ghosts of our past, a permanent record of the crimes that had altered the course of our lives 15 years ago. Miller leaned over my shoulder, his gray eyes fixed on the miniature spool of film with the sharp intensity of a predator closing in on its prey. He whispered that this microfilm was exactly what we needed to secure an ironclad indictment from a federal grand jury in Seattle. Evelyn could argue that digital files were manipulated, or that emails were fabricated by corporate enemies. But a physical spool of microfilm developed before the crash was an undeniable historical truth. We had the chemical invoices. We had the paper trail of the bribes. And now we held the definitive visual proof that would tie the entire conspiracy together. Arthur immediately went over to the corner of his office, pulling a heavy canvas cover off a massive, vintage optical microfilm reader that he had kept fully operational for his historical research. The machine groaned as he flipped the power switch. A bright white projection lamp flickering to life and casting a brilliant square of light onto the frosted glass screen. The cooling fan began to hum with a steady mechanical rhythm, filling the quiet space with a sound that felt like the beginning of an execution for the monsters at the estate. I carried the small spool of film toward the machine, my heart pounding against my ribs as we prepared to project the dark secrets of Evelyn Mackenzie into the light of day. The vintage optical reader hummed loudly as the cooling fan kicked into gear, blowing a thin stream of warm, dusty air across my face. Arthur Vance carefully threaded the miniature ribbon of microfilm through the delicate glass rollers, his wrinkled fingers moving with absolute precision. The bright white light from the projection lamp sliced through the dim office, throwing a brilliant, blinding square onto the frosted screen. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only a blur of gray shadows and scratches sliding across the glass. Then, Arthur turned a small black dial on the side of the machine, and the blurry shapes snapped into crystal-clear focus. The first document projected onto the screen was a collection of official environmental laboratory reports bearing the federal seal from 15 years ago. My eyes raced across the text, scanning the dense columns of chemical data and geological coordinates that Sarah had meticulously compiled. The documents provided undeniable proof that the mining corporation backed by Evelyn had been intentionally dumping toxic chemical runoff directly into the primary watershed of our valley. They had knowingly poisoned the underground water tables to force the local ranching families into bankruptcy, allowing Evelyn to purchase their ancestral lands for pennies on the dollar. Sarah had uncovered this horrific environmental crime during her university field research, making her an immediate, lethal threat to Evelyn's multi-million-dollar corporate expansion plans. As Arthur turned the roller mechanism further, a second document slid into the center of the illuminated screen, causing my old heart to stop completely. It was a scanned copy of a legal contract, but it was not a corporate ledger or an environmental report. At the top of the page, written in bold, traditional letters, were the words stating it was the final will and testament of my late first wife, Catherine. Catherine had passed away from what we believed was a sudden illness just a year before Sarah's plane vanished into the mountains. Seeing her elegant handwriting on the screen felt like a hand reaching out from the grave to guide us through this dark maze of betrayal. Theodore Miller leaned closer to the glass screen, his thumb tracing the legal clauses outlined in the text with intense focus. He pointed to a specific, heavily detailed paragraph near the bottom of the document that contained an ironclad asset protection restriction. Catherine had quietly established a separate, independent legal shield for all the ancestral valley lands and the primary timber rights. The will explicitly stated that these core properties were to be held in a blind trust exclusively for Sarah, completely isolated from any future marriage I might enter into. Catherine had seen through Evelyn's greedy nature long before I ever did, and she had taken steps to ensure our family legacy could never be stolen by an outsider. The legal language was absolute and unyielding, effectively locking the ownership of the entire valley behind an impenetrable wall that required Sarah's direct signature to dissolve. Evelyn had spent the last 10 years operating a massive shell company, believing she had total executive control over the Mackenzie empire. In reality, every single timber lease she had signed and every land development deal she had negotiated was completely illegal without Sarah's consent. The contract she was preparing to finalize on Friday morning with the Delaware conglomerate was a massive act of federal fraud. She was attempting to sell billions of dollars worth of property that she did not legally own. A desperate gamble that would trigger an immediate federal investigation the moment the deeds were filed. But the microfilm contained one final, damning piece of evidence that stripped away whatever remaining doubt we had about Evelyn's criminal operations. The final section of the film displayed a chronological ledger of corporate banking transfers originating from our primary sawmill accounts over the last 10 years. Beside each transaction sat a digital copy of an authorization form bearing what appeared to be my own personal signature. I leaned in until my face was just inches from the glowing glass, my eyes tracking the specific loops and angles of the ink on the paper. It looked remarkably like my handwriting, perfectly replicating the unique flourish I always used at the end of my name. Arthur Vance reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a specialized high-powered jeweler's loupe and pressing it against the frosted screen to examine the signature lines. He studied the ink density for a long minute before shaking his head with a look of deep disgust on his wrinkled face. He explained that the signature was a highly sophisticated, mechanical forgery executed by an advanced automated signing machine known as an auto pen. Evelyn had taken a genuine signature from our old marriage certificate and programmed it into a digital device hidden inside her private office. For a decade, she had been using this machine to systematically sign my name to hundreds of fraudulent financial documents, transferring millions of dollars out of the timber mills and routing the funds directly into anonymous shell accounts based in Delaware. The scale of her systematic theft was breathtaking. A cold-blooded financial execution that had been carried out right under my nose while I hid away in my noisy blacksmith shop. She had treated my grief as a weapon, using my isolation to bleed my family legacy dry, while pretending to be the devoted wife who saved me from my sorrow. The realization settled into my gut like a block of solid lead, turning my anger into a freezing, calculated determination to see her utterly destroyed. We now held the complete puzzle in our hands. The motive for the original Musat, the proof of the environmental crimes, the mother's protective will, and a decade of systemic federal forgery. Miller turned away from the optical reader, a grim, satisfied smile breaking across his weathered face as he slapped his heavy hand down onto the wooden desk. He stated that this microfilm was the absolute silver bullet that would dismantle Evelyn's empire within a matter of minutes. No high-priced corporate defense attorney from Delaware could ever challenge the validity of this physical film, which had remained sealed inside a grandfather's rifle since before the plane crash. The legal trap was completely finalized, and all that remained was for us to return to the valley and pull the trigger on the machine of justice we had built. I looked at Sarah, who was watching the glowing screen with a quiet, peaceful expression on her scarred face, knowing that the ghost of her mother had just given us the power to reclaim our lives. I left Theodore Miller and Sarah safe at the hidden warehouse in Helena, driving back alone through the frozen valleys toward the dark silhouette of the Mackenzie estate mansion. The headlights of my truck cut through the black winter night, reflecting off the pristine, iron gates of the massive property that my grandfather had built with his own sweat. This house had once been filled with warmth and the laughter of my daughter, but now it felt like a cold, hollow mausoleum built out of expensive stone and stolen dreams. I parked the truck in the brick courtyard, turning off the engine and sitting in the quiet darkness for a long minute to steady my nerves before stepping into the viper's nest. I had to bury my burning rage deep within my chest, molding my face into the mask of a broken, weary old man who had completely given up on life. The heavy oak front door opened with a soft click, and the warmth of the grand foyer immediately washed over me, carrying the distinct and suffocating scent of lavender perfume. Evelyn was standing at the top of the grand spiral staircase, her silk robe trailing behind her as she looked down at me with sharp, calculating eyes. She held a crystal glass of amber wine in her hand, her posture exuding the absolute arrogance of a monarch who believed her throne was completely secure. I did not meet her gaze, instead lowering my head, letting my shoulders slump forward, and wiping my boots with a slow, exaggerated exhaustion that painted the perfect picture of defeat. She glided down the steps without a sound, her lips curved into a thin, patronizing smile that made my stomach twist with absolute disgust. "You look terrible, Mac," she said, her voice dripping with a false, honeyed sympathy that could not hide the cold indifference underneath. She walked around me, her sharp eyes scanning my mud-stained winter jacket and my weary, hollow expression, searching for any sign of defiance or suspicion. I forced my voice to crack slightly as I replied, telling her that the harsh winter weather was finally catching up to my old bones, and that my mind was growing tired of fighting the shadows of the past. I played the part of the compliant, submissive husband flawlessly, letting her believe that my recent absences were just the desperate actions of a grieving father hiding away in his dusty workshop. She reached out and patted my arm with a manicured hand, a dismissive gesture that felt like an owner reassuring a loyal but broken old dog. She led me into the grand library, where a massive mahogany desk was covered in neat stacks of legal folders and corporate contracts prepared by her high-priced legal team from Delaware. Evelyn sat down behind the desk, leaning back in the plush leather chair that used to belong to my father, and gestured for me to take a seat across from her. She poured another glass of wine, her movements confident and full of a predatory grace as she prepared to deliver the final blow to the Mackenzie legacy. She looked at me with a gaze that was completely devoid of any genuine human warmth, stating that the board of directors had reached an executive decision regarding the future of our timberlands. She explained that a major international conglomerate had extended a final, non-negotiable purchase offer for the entire Ancestral Valley land rights. Evelyn watched my face intensely as she spoke, waiting to see if the mention of selling my family land would rouse any of the old Mackenzie pride or defiance. I kept my expression perfectly blank, my eyes fixed on the polished surface of the wood, refusing to let a single spark of my inner fury show on the outside. She stated that the legal documents were completely prepared, and that the senior partners of the law firm would be arriving at the estate on Friday morning at exactly 10 o'clock to finalize the closing agreement. She explained that my signature was required on the final transfer deeds to officially validate the transaction and transition the assets into their new corporate structure. She spoke with a cold, absolute certainty, treating the destruction of my family history as a simple, necessary piece of business that was already a done deal. I let out a long, heavy sigh, letting my hands rest limply on my lap like a man who had completely run out of options and strength to fight against the tide. I looked up at her with hollow, defeated eyes and whispered that I no longer cared about the mills or the valley lands, as they only reminded me of the child we had lost 15 years ago. I told her that if she believed this sale was the best path forward for our future, I would not stand in her way or cause any unnecessary delays on Friday morning. I promised her that I would be present in the executive conference room, ready to sign whatever papers her attorneys placed in front of me, so we could finally put the past to rest. A flash of intense triumph danced across Evelyn's face, her eyes widening slightly as she absorbed my total submission to her demands. She sat forward, her smile widening into a genuine, arrogant display of satisfaction that revealed the true depth of her malicious nature. She praised my wisdom, telling me that this decision was the best thing for both of us, and that it would allow us to finally leave the bitter memories of Montana behind for a peaceful retirement in Europe. She had absolutely no idea that her grand victory was nothing but a mirage, an elaborate illusion designed to lead her straight into the mouth of a waiting trap. She believed she had successfully broken my spirit, unaware that my submissive words were the final pieces of grease applied to the legal gears that would soon crush her entire existence. Evelyn picked up her crystal glass, raising it toward me in a silent, mocking toast to our upcoming financial windfall before dismissing me to my bedroom for the night. I stood up slowly, nodding my head in a quiet show of obedience, and walked out of the library with the heavy, dragging steps of a defeated man. But the moment I stepped into the dark corridor and closed the heavy oak door behind me, my posture straightened and my jaw set into a hard, diamond line of absolute resolve. The final arena had been established. The players were locked into their positions, and the countdown to Friday morning had officially begun. I walked up the stairs to my solitary room, a cold satisfaction settling into my bones as I realized that Evelyn's boundless arrogance had just blinded her to the most satisfying trap she would ever witness. The steel trap snaps shut. The deep shadow of Thursday night hung heavily over the frozen valley, casting a cold chill that seemed to seep directly into the solid stone walls of the executive wing. The grand conference room of the Mackenzie Timber Enterprise was pitch black, its massive mahogany table reflecting nothing but the dim starlight bleeding through the heavily frosted glass windows. I stood near the side entrance, my pulse steady and deliberate, feeling the cold weight of the keys in my hand as I listened to the quiet crunch of the winter wind outside. Theodore Miller stepped through the threshold without making a single sound, a dark silhouette moving with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned federal operative who had spent a lifetime navigating the shadows. Behind him, 3 men dressed in unmarked black tactical jackets carried heavy canvas duffel bags filled with specialized electronic surveillance equipment. This was the final night of preparation, the quiet hours before the morning storm, where the entire arena had to be mapped out in total secrecy from the rest of the world. The federal agents did not speak a word, their communication happening through simple hand signals and the quiet rustle of synthetic fabric as they unpacked their specialized tools on the soft carpet. They immediately went to work on the high oak paneling of the grand room, using precision drills with dampened motors to hollow out tiny spaces behind the historic oil paintings of my ancestors. Within 45 minutes, 3 microscopic camera lens arrays were perfectly hidden inside the heavy wooden frames, their fields of view overlapping to capture every single angle of the conference table. Every sigh, every sudden twitch of Evelyn's face, and every stroke of her fountain pen would be recorded in crisp, high definition, beamed directly to a mobile command unit parked 3 miles away in the pine forest. Miller knelt by the primary telephone connection box beneath the floorboards, his thick fingers working with specialized wiretaps to intercept the room's physical communication lines. He hooked up a digital audio recording array that was completely invisible to any standard commercial sweeping device Evelyn's legal team might use to check the room for security breaches. I watched him work under the dim beam of a small red tactical flashlight, the low hum of the electronic components signaling the successful activation of our digital net. This room, which Evelyn believed was her ultimate fortress of corporate conquest and greed, was being systematically converted into a federal interception cage. Every single piece of evidence needed to be absolute, leaving no room for a clever corporate defense lawyer to claim a breach of custody or a lack of authentication when the case reached a federal judge. While the federal agents finalized the hardware installation around the perimeter of the room, I sat in the corner, shadow, pulling out an encrypted satellite tablet that Marcus Vance had provided from his office in Seattle. I logged into the private, secure server of the Montana Legacy Trust, the legal fortress we had quietly built 3 years ago in the deep winter of 2021. My fingers hovered over the glass screen as I verified the digital lock mechanisms on the primary assets of the Mackenzie Empire, ensuring that every safeguard was fully operational. The ancestral timberlands, the vital water rights, the heavy manufacturing machinery, and the primary active bank accounts were all locked behind an ironclad multi-signature protocol that required my physical presence and approval. Evelyn's corporate shell company, which she was preparing to sell for $22 million on Friday morning, had been legally stripped of its core value down to its bare bones. The active valuation left inside her fraudulent company amounted to exactly $40,000. A tiny sum intentionally left behind to cover the basic structural registration fees and minor operational accounts. It was a beautiful, devastating piece of legal architecture. An empty vault that felt perfectly real on paper but contained nothing but smoke and ashes for her buyers. Evelyn believed she was holding the ultimate leverage over my life, but she was actually holding a massive lead anchor that would drag her directly into a federal penitentiary for grand fraud and conspiracy. She had spent 10 long years playing a game of boundless greed, and tonight we were officially setting the board to let her take her final, fatal move. I closed the tablet, the screen fading into complete blackness, and felt a cold wave of profound satisfaction wash over my old bones as the agents finished sealing the access panels. One of the federal agents stepped up to me, handing me a microscopic wireless earpiece, bathed in flesh-colored polymer that would sit completely hidden inside my ear canal during the meeting. He explained that a team of federal prosecutors and field agents would be listening to the entire conversation in real time, ready to move the moment the fraud was legally executed by her signature. Miller walked over, his heavy sheepskin coat smelling of the cold mountain air, and patted my shoulder with a reassuring pressure that signaled the end of our midnight operation. He whispered that the arena was officially set, and that all I needed to do tomorrow morning was to stay calm, play the part of the defeated husband, and let her pride drive her into the center of the net. We walked out of the executive wing using the old servant tunnels beneath the estate, leaving the grand conference room in absolute darkness, a perfect iron cage waiting for the morning light to reveal the final judgment. Friday morning arrived with a blinding glare of winter sun bouncing off the freshly fallen snow outside the executive conference room windows. The grand mahogany table was immaculate, its long surface flanked by heavy leather chairs that seemed to wait for a quiet execution. Evelyn sat at the head of the corporate table, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, her posture exuding the total confidence of a predator about to claim its final prize. Her wrist was adorned with an expensive diamond watch that caught the sunlight, throwing small shards of light across the walls. Beside her sat her senior corporate attorney from Delaware, a man named Henderson, who possessed a predatory smile and a sharp silver pen. The antique clock on the walnut-paneled wall chimed 10 times, its steady mechanical ring echoing through the tense silence of the room. I sat opposite them, letting my hands rest limply on the polished wood surface, playing the part of the defeated old blacksmith to absolute perfection. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice carrying an edge of intense triumph as she pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the table toward me. She stated that these were the final transfer deeds for the Ancestral Valley land rights and the primary manufacturing timber mills. She spoke with a cold, absolute certainty, treating the destruction of my family history as a simple piece of closing business. Henderson leaned into the light, his manicured fingers pointing toward the highlighted signature lines at the bottom of the clean white parchment pages. He explained that upon my physical signature, the international conglomerate would officially assume total executive control of the Mackenzie Enterprise assets. He highlighted the final line with his silver pen, whispering that a wire transfer of $22 million was pending my immediate validation. I looked at the white sheets, letting a heavy, calculated sigh escape my chest to maintain the illusion of my complete submission. I picked up the heavy fountain pen Evelyn provided, my fingers holding the gold nib over the paper for a few agonized seconds. I watched Evelyn's eyes widen with a sudden surge of boundless greed, her breath hitching in her throat as she anticipated the final closure of her plot. She had spent 15 long years working toward this exact minute, weaving her web of deceit to strip my family name from the valley. I brought the pen down and signed my name with a swift, deliberate flourish, the scratch of the ink against the paper sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. Evelyn let out a soft gasp of pure victory, her hand immediately reaching out across the mahogany table to snatch the signed documents away from me. But before her fingers could touch the edges of the paper, I kept my large, calloused palm pressed firmly down against the sheets, preventing her from reclaiming them. I looked up at her, my slouched shoulders instantly straightening as a cold, diamond-hard clarity returned to my gaze for the first time in a decade. The weary, broken old man she thought she had conquered vanished into thin air, replaced by the calculating eyes of a reconnaissance soldier who had just locked his target. Evelyn's hand froze in midair, her thin lips curving downward into a sudden line of deep confusion as she registered the drastic shift in my demeanor. I reached deep into the interior pocket of my winter coat and pulled out a separate blue manila folder, sliding it calmly across the polished mahogany table, directly toward her. I told her in a low, steady voice that she should read the certified financial addendum before she began celebrating her grand retirement plans in Europe. Henderson snatched the folder away from her, his confident smile fading into a mask of pure bewilderment as his eyes scanned the official legal certificate within. It was the certified asset declaration of the Montana Legacy Trust, the separate legal entity I had quietly established 3 years ago in the winter of 2021. I explained to the silent room that every single acre of our ancestral timberlands, the vital water rights, and the heavy manufacturing machinery had been legally moved into that private trust years ago. Evelyn's corporate shell company, which she had spent a decade bleeding dry and preparing to sell, had been completely stripped of its core value down to its bare bones. Henderson's face turned an ashen, sickly gray as he dropped the papers onto the mahogany table, his hands trembling violently as he turned to look at his client. He shouted at her that the entire corporation she was attempting to transfer to his buyers was nothing but an empty vault containing smoke and mirrors. He revealed that the active valuation left inside her fraudulent shell company amounted to exactly $40,000 instead of the $22 million promised in the contract. Evelyn bolted upright from her leather chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard that her manicured nails dug into the polished wood finish. The absolute arrogance that had defined her features for 15 long years shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of pure, unadulterated panic. She stared down at the documents, her chest heaving as she realized that her grand corporate victory was nothing but a hollow mirage designed to lead her straight into ruin. She attempted to speak, but her voice failed her, leaving nothing but a harsh, choked gasp echoing off the walnut walls of the executive conference room. She turned her wild, frantic gaze toward Henderson, demanding that he fix the legal discrepancy. But the attorney was already gathering his private files in a desperate bid to distance himself from the disaster. He whispered harshly that if she had attempted to finalize a sale of property she did not legally own, she had committed a massive act of federal wire fraud. The legal trap had snapped shut with a definitive, mechanical precision, locking her inside an iron cage of her own boundless greed. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I watched the utter chaos unfold across the oak table. A deep, icy satisfaction settling into my old bones. The years of forced patience, the silent nights spent in my smoky blacksmith shop, and the agonizing weight of my hidden sorrow had all led to this magnificent moment of absolute reckoning. Evelyn was trapped inside the very boardroom where she had plotted to erase my family legacy, facing the total destruction of her hollow empire. But as she opened her mouth to scream an accusation at me, the heavy double doors of the conference room began to tremble, signaling that the final phase of her execution was about to walk through the threshold. The air inside the executive conference room turned thick and suffocating, so heavy that every breath felt like inhaling cold ash. Evelyn remained frozen behind the mahogany desk, her fingers still hovering over the fraudulent papers as if she could somehow wish the reality away. Henderson was completely silent now, his silver pen clattering onto the floorboards as he took 3 panicked steps backward, attempting to separate himself from the woman who had just dragged him into a federal trap. The sudden, violent rattling of the heavy double doors broke the silence, vibrating through the solid walnut panels and signaling that the hour of reckoning had finally arrived. The heavy oak doors burst open with a deafening crash that echoed off the high ceiling of the corporate wing. A disciplined line of federal special agents flooded into the room, their dark tactical jackets and polished boots moving with absolute military precision. Within a matter of seconds, they had established a tight perimeter around the mahogany table, blocking every single window and emergency exit with their bodies. Their weapons were raised, their expressions completely devoid of warmth or mercy as they locked their eyes onto Evelyn and her terrified legal representative. Theodore Miller stepped through the shattered threshold first, his golden federal badge gleaming under the bright winter sunlight streaming through the glass. He did not say a word, simply moving to the side of the doorway to establish a clear path for the true authority arriving to reclaim our history. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, my old heart pounding with a mixture of overwhelming pride and anticipation as I watched the entrance. The silent workshop nights and the long years of carrying a heavy burden of sorrow were finally fading away, making room for the light of absolute truth. Sarah walked into the grand conference room, her head held high and her posture projecting an undeniable, fierce dignity that commanded the entire space. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal business suit that mirrored the formal corporate environment, but her presence was a complete contrast to the corporate greed that had defined this room. She wore no veil, no heavy makeup, and no scarves to hide the extensive, silver-colored scars tracing across her cheekbones and her temple. She wore her physical trauma like a suit of unyielding armor, a visible testament to her survival and a silent accusation against the monsters who had tried to erase her from the earth. The sight of my daughter standing there was a magnificent monument of pure, unyielding justice that left me breathless. She did not look like the ragged, broken drifter who had collapsed on my forge floor just days ago amidst the roaring blizzard. The confusion and panic that had clouded her dark eyes had vanished entirely, replaced by a crystal-clear focus and a cold, calculating intensity that belonged to a true Mackenzie. She walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, her footsteps sounding like the steady tick of an execution clock, echoing through the quiet room. Evelyn let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as her entire body began to tremble with a primal, animal terror. Her face turned an ashen, sickly gray color that made her expensive makeup look like a fading mask on a ghost. Her wide eyes locked onto Sarah's scarred face, her pupils dilating until they almost swallowed the green irises entirely as her mind fought against the physical reality standing before her. She tried to rise from her plush leather chair, but her legs failed her completely, her knees buckling under the immense weight of her sudden panic. Sarah walked directly to the head of the mahogany table, stopping just 3 feet away from the woman who had spent 15 years sleeping in her mother's bed and spending her family fortune. She looked down at Evelyn with a gaze that was completely devoid of hatred or anger, expressing only a cold, judicial detachment that was far more terrifying than rage. The silence in the room was absolute, so dense that I could hear the rapid, shallow hyperventilation of Evelyn as her lungs struggled to draw air into her collapsing chest. The federal agents stood like stone pillars around them, their presence sealing the trap that had been decades in the making. Henderson dropped to his knees near the corner couch, his hands raised high in the air as he frantically shouted to the federal agents that he had no knowledge of the original plot or the identity of the woman standing before them. He was a man who had built a career on legal manipulation, but he knew that a federal obstruction and grand fraud charge would end his life behind bars. No one looked at him, his desperate pleas for safety completely ignored, as the final arena narrowed down to the 2 women facing each other at the end of the table. Evelyn's fingers clawed frantically at the fine fabric of her suit jacket, her mind completely fracturing as the grand empire of lies she had built began to collapse around her shoulders. She shook her head wildly from side to side, her breath coming in short, clicking gasps that sounded like a dying animal cornered by a hunter. A low, desperate whimper escaped her thin lips, a sound of pure madness as her boundless arrogance was utterly crushed by the presence of the ultimate witness. "You were supposed to be dead in the Rockies," Evelyn muttered over and over again, her voice dropping into a frantic, breathless rasp that betrayed her complete loss of sanity. She repeated the words like a dark prayer, her eyes darting between Sarah's silver scars and the blue manila folders scattered across the polished oak table. "You were supposed to be dead," she screamed suddenly, her voice cracking with a terrifying pitch that signaled the permanent end of her deception and the absolute victory of our family fortress. Evelyn's frantic screams bounced hollowly off the dark walnut panels, her voice losing power as reality settled into her bones. The desperate denial that erupted from her lips faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, far more damning than any confession. Sarah did not react to the outbursts, keeping her eyes fixed on the table with absolute composure. She stepped forward with a slow grace, her boots clicking softly as she approached the mahogany surface. Every eye followed her movements, the federal agents standing like iron statues, while Theodore Miller watched with quiet satisfaction. Sarah reached down toward her waist, unfastening the large silver belt buckle that caught the brilliant rays of the winter sun. She placed the silver emblem directly onto the polished mahogany wood, sliding it forward until it rested in front of Evelyn's trembling hands. The buckle sat between them like a monument of old secrets, its surface battered by years of harsh weather. Evelyn stared down at the silver, her breathing coming in short gasps as she recognized the unique craftsmanship of our family. Sarah extended her left hand, her long thumb settling onto a tiny ridge hidden within the deeply chiseled feathers of the falcon's wingtip. With a firm, calculated pressure, Sarah pressed down on the hidden latch mechanism that I had helped her design. A sharp, mechanical click echoed through the quiet room, a sound so crisp that it broke the remaining tension. The front plate of the silver buckle flipped open on a microscopic brass hinge, revealing a hollow chamber drilled into the core. Nestled deep within the narrow velvet-lined space sat a tiny, black, rectangular object. A micro-secure digital memory card wrapped in polymer silicone. This miniature piece of digital technology had remained sealed inside the silver vault for 15 long years, completely protected from the elements. Sarah had possessed the incredible foresight as a young girl to create a permanent record of the corruption. She carefully extracted the tiny memory card from the chamber, her fingers steady as she peeled away the protective silicone seal. She handed the clean black card to the retired federal detective, her dark eyes flashing with a quiet, triumphant brilliance. Theodore Miller stepped forward immediately, pulling a specialized portable forensic reading device and a high-powered digital speaker system from his briefcase. He inserted the micro-secure digital card into the slot, his thick fingers moving across the controls with practiced efficiency. A low electronic hum signaled the successful connection, a blue indicator light flickering to life and casting a pale glow. Miller looked up at the federal special agents stationed around the room, receiving a firm nod to initiate the playback. A loud burst of static suddenly erupted from the high-powered speakers, a harsh sound that filled the grand conference room. The white noise gradually receded into the background, replaced by the distinct, rhythmic drumming of heavy rain hitting a roof. A digital timestamp appeared on the screen of the device, flashing the exact date of November 14th, 2011. Then, a voice emerged from the audio track, a cold cadence instantly recognizable to every single person sitting at the table. It was the voice of Evelyn Blanchard, her tone completely devoid of the honeyed sympathy she used to deceive me. She was speaking to Walter Vance, the senior aviation mechanic who had mysteriously disappeared immediately after the disaster. The audio clarity was absolute, captured by a high-grade digital recording application Sarah had patched through her phone lines long ago. Evelyn's recorded voice spoke with a terrifying precision as she delivered her final instructions regarding the modification of the fuel system. You need to make absolutely sure that the chemical compound is applied directly to the primary rubber gaskets before the morning inspection, the voice stated. The recording continued, explaining that the progressive degradation of the seals had to occur slowly, over several hours. It needs to look like a tragic weather accident caused by the blinding mountain blizzard. So the investigators closed the file. She commanded. The mechanic's voice responded on the tape, his tone hesitant and laced with anxiety as he weighed the risks. He demanded an immediate guarantee of safety and an additional payment of $40,000 in cash before touching the manifolds. Evelyn's recorded response was immediate and full of a dismissive, boundless arrogance that revealed her malicious soul. She promised him that the cash would be delivered via an anonymous courier service to his private account in Idaho. Evelyn stared blankly at the digital speakers, her mouth hanging wide open as her own words wrapped around her neck. Every single syllable she had uttered in the darkness 15 years ago was being dragged into the light of day. Henderson covered his face with his trembling hands, letting out a soft groan of pure defeat as he listened. He knew that no amount of corporate legal manipulation could ever save his client from a life behind bars. The federal special agents adjusted their recording devices, locking down the absolute verbal confession that would seal her fate permanently. The audio recording continued to play, shifting from the quiet conversation in the hangar to the internal cockpit audio track. The loud, mechanical roar of the private aircraft's twin engines filled the conference room, bringing the mountain disaster into the boardroom. We could hear the steady click of the control switches and the calm voice of the pilot navigating the storm. Sarah sat perfectly still next to me, her scarred face bathed in the sunlight, watching the destruction with inner peace. Suddenly, the steady mechanical drone of the engines gave way to a violent, high-pitched whistle of escaping system pressure. A chaotic chorus of alarms began to blare through the speakers, signaling a catastrophic fuel leak onto the manifolds. The pilot's voice erupted in a frantic series of distress calls, trying desperately to regain control as the pressure dropped to zero. The audio track reached a terrifying, deafening crescendo as a massive mechanical explosion shattered the soundscape, cutting out into an absolute, chilling wall of white static that marked the end of the flight and the beginning of our long journey toward vengeance. The chilling wall of white static faded from the forensic speakers, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like the heavy stillness inside a mountain tomb. Evelyn sat completely motionless in her plush leather chair, her fingers frozen in their desperate clawing posture on the edge of the mahogany table. Her gaze was fixed blindly on the spinning digital tape indicators of the forensic reader, her mind utterly unable to process the absolute destruction of her carefully constructed reality. The recorded voice that had commanded the destruction of my daughter had echoed through the boardroom,
stripping away every single layer of her defense and exposing her naked malice.
Henderson, her high-priced corporate attorney from Delaware, was the first one to completely snap under the immense pressure of the evidence. His face transformed from a mask of professional arrogance into a terrifying display of feral, primitive panic. He scrambled backward, his heavy leather chair overturning with a loud, splintering crash against the hardwood floor as he scrambled toward Evelyn. His manicured hands clenched into tight fists, his eyes bulging with a manic intensity as he realized his career, his freedom, and his entire life were turning to ash right before his eyes. "You stupid, greedy monster!" Henderson shrieked, his voice cracking with a high-pitched terror that shook the quiet air of the executive conference room. He lunged across the corner of the table, his fingers wrapping around the collar of Evelyn's expensive charcoal suit jacket and shaking her violently. "You lied to me about the assets. You lied about the survival of the girl. And you dragged me straight into a federal penitentiary for grand conspiracy," he screamed directly into her face. Evelyn did not even blink, her head wobbling loosely under his violent grip as she remained trapped in a state of absolute catatonic shock. Henderson's desperation turned into physical violence as he squeezed his fingers tighter, attempting to force some reaction from the broken woman. He demanded to know where the hidden funds were, accusing her of hoarding the $10 million conglomerate deposit in a private account he could not access. The illusion of their sophisticated corporate alliance vanished within seconds, leaving behind nothing but two cornered rats tearing each other apart in the shadows of their failed plot. They had spent a decade exploiting my family wealth together, but the moment the trap snapped shut, their mutual loyalty evaporated into thin air. Two heavy federal special agents moved instantly, their large hands gripping Henderson's shoulders and violently wrenching him away from the catatonic woman. They slammed the attorney face down onto the polished mahogany table, pinning his arms behind his back with absolute, brutal efficiency. The silver fountain pen he had used to highlight the fraudulent contract spun across the wood, falling off the edge and landing in the dust of the floorboards. Henderson let out a muffled sob against the polished surface, his professional dignity utterly ruined, as the cold reality of his situation settled deep into his spine. Federal Prosecutor Holbrook stepped through the shattered threshold of the conference room, his long black wool coat trailing behind his steady, rhythmic footsteps. He held a thick stack of federal arrest warrants in his left hand, the official seals of the United States government gleaming under the bright winter light. He walked to the head of the mahogany table, standing right beside Sarah and me, and looked down at Evelyn with a cold, judicial authority that signaled the final end of her criminal reign. He did not offer any formal pleasantries to the room, instead pulling a small laminated card from his interior breast pocket. "You have the right to remain silent," Holbrook began, his voice echoing through the boardroom with a deep, resonant clarity that sounded like a final judgment. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," he continued, reading the traditional text of the Miranda rights with a slow, deliberate cadence. "You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you while you are being questioned," he stated, his eyes shifting momentarily to the weeping Henderson pinned against the table. Evelyn remained completely motionless, her eyes wide and blank, completely deaf to the legal words stripping away her remaining civil liberties. A senior special agent stepped behind Evelyn's chair, pulling a pair of heavy, gleaming steel handcuffs from his tactical belt assembly. He grabbed her limp right wrist, pulling it behind her back, and then secured the left hand with a sharp, metallic click that echoed through the room. The distinct sound of the double locking mechanism of the handcuffs snapping shut was the most beautiful melody I had heard in 15 long years. It was the definitive sound of the law reclaiming our valley, the absolute iron proof that the monster who had paid to erase my child was finally bound in chains. The federal agents hauled Henderson to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back and securing his wrists with an identical pair of heavy steel restraints. He continued to weep openly, his tears smudging the fresh blue ink on the fraudulent corporate documents scattered across the table. He begged Holbrook for a plea agreement, promising to testify against Evelyn and reveal every single hidden shell account in Delaware if they would spare him from a maximum security facility. The prosecutor completely ignored his desperate pleas, gesturing for the field agents to remove the prisoners from the executive wing immediately. Evelyn was lifted from her chair, her legs dragging uselessly along the plush carpet as the agents guided her toward the shattered double doors. She did not look back at me, nor did she dare to look at the scarred face of the daughter she had tried to murder so long ago. The boundless arrogance that had defined her existence for over a decade had been completely replaced by a hollow, broken emptiness. She was led down the grand spiral staircase of the mansion in absolute public humiliation, her criminal empire completely reduced to dust before the eyes of the valley. The road back home. 3 months crawled past like the slow melting of mountain ice before the final hammers of justice delivered their heavy verdicts in the federal courthouse of Seattle. The majestic wooden courtroom was bathed in a somber gray light as Federal Judge Westbrook peered down from his high bench with an expression of absolute, unyielding discipline. Evelyn Blanchard Mackenzie sat at the defense table, her expensive charcoal suit replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit that stripped away the last remaining illusions of her corporate royalty. Her manicured hands were locked in heavy steel restraints, her pale face staring blankly at the polished mahogany wood as the judge began to read the final sentence of the court. For the crimes of grand federal wire fraud, systemic forgery, and conspiracy to commit MUSAT, she was sentenced to serve 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Beside her, Henderson wept openly into his chained hands as his own sentence of 22 years was read aloud into the quiet room. His legal career utterly shattered by his own boundless greed. I sat in the front row of the spectator gallery, my arm wrapped protectively around Sarah's shoulders, feeling a profound wave of relief wash over my weary soul as the heavy gavel finally slammed down onto the wooden block. The long journey through the darkness was officially over. The ghosts of our past, finally laid to rest by the unyielding power of the law. We walked out of the federal courthouse into the bright spring sunshine, leaving the ruins of Evelyn's criminal empire behind us forever, as we prepared to return to our valley. The following week, the executive boardroom of the Mackenzie Timber Enterprise was filled with the rough, calloused working men who had kept our sawmills running through the darkest winters. I stood at the head of the table, holding a heavy gold pen. But I was not there to sign a corporate merger or a fraudulent land transfer to an offshore conglomerate. Instead, I signed the official legal deeds that systematically transferred the entire $22 million timber empire into a private cooperative owned exclusively by the local lumberjacks and blacksmiths. I sold the massive inheritance to the Union of Working Families for a purchase price of exactly $12, keeping only the small ancestral blacksmith forge and the surrounding acreage for myself and my daughter. The working men erupted into a thunderous roar of cheers and tears, their heavy hands clapping my back as they realized their ancestral home had been permanently secured for generations to come. Sarah and I drove back to the old forest cabin that afternoon, the mountain air carrying the sweet, clean scent of damp pine needles and fresh earth as the spring thaw transformed the landscape. The roaring blizzards of Flathead County had given way to fields of wild green sprouts breaking through the white crust. A beautiful monument of nature's ability to heal after a brutal season. We walked into the old forge together, the red furnace remaining cold for now, but the space felt light and spacious, stripped of the heavy sorrow that had haunted its corners for 15 long years. I walked over to the heavy cast-iron anvil, picking up my favorite cross-peen hammer and holding it out toward my daughter with a proud, peaceful smile. Sarah stepped into the light of the workshop window, her scarred face completely illuminated by the warm afternoon sun as she accepted the heavy hickory handle with her left hand. She did not tremble this time, her fingers wrapping around the wood with absolute confidence and a deep sense of belonging that warmed my heart. I picked up a secondary, smaller hammer from the cooling rack, stepping up to the opposite side of the massive anvil until we stood eye to eye as partners. Together, we raised our heavy metal tools high into the warm air, catching the brilliant shards of sunlight dancing through the open door. Our hammers came down in a perfect, synchronized motion, striking the dark iron surface with a magnificent, deafening crash that echoed through the wooden rafters. A split second later, we delivered a rapid sequence of double strikes, creating a beautiful, bouncing rhythm that vibrated through the stone floorboards of the workshop. The unique cadence rang out across the clearing, a private language of survival and love that filled the entire valley with its powerful melody. From the distant tree line, the sharp ring of axes and the low hum of the timber mills seemed to answer our rhythm, a grand chorus of a community welcoming its true keepers back to the land. Sarah paused for a brief minute, reaching down to touch the large silver belt buckle resting on the workbench beside the anvil. The hand-carved silhouette of the mountain falcon seemed to gleam with a newfound brilliance, its intricate feathers no longer hiding dark secrets or microchips. I looked at her dark eyes and whispered that the ancient silversmiths of the mountains always claimed that silver was the color of those who know the exact way back home. She smiled at me, a genuine, beautiful expression that completely transformed her features, proving that her spirit had fully broken through the chains of her past trauma. Thank you for standing by my side through every single step of this long, dangerous journey into the heart of the Montana wilderness to reclaim my daughter and destroy the empire of deceit. If you found this final reckoning and the ultimate triumph of justice satisfying, please make sure to strike that subscribe button. Leave a comment below to honor Sarah's incredible resilience, and share this story with those who believe that truth will always outlast the dark. This is the Revenge Dad channel, signing off from the free and peaceful mountains of Flathead County, reminding you to always guard your legacy and never let the fire in your forge go out.